In his capacity, Mr. Adams serves as the lead staffer for Senator Tillis on the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Development. Ryan has been on Senator Tillis' staff for 4.5 years. Originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, Mr. Adams holds a BA from the University of South Carolina in political science. Ryan, thank you so much for being with us.
Yep, happy to.
Sam currently serves as legislative correspondent to Senator Tillis, covering also economic, business, banking, tax, trade policy portfolio. Mr. Lupus also works on a team covering education, infrastructure, transportation, and economic development issues for Senator Tillis. Sam has been with Senator Tillis for 2 years. Originally from Cashiers, North Carolina, Mr. Lupus holds a BSBA in finance with a minor in political science from Auburn. Thanks to both of you guys for joining us. We're really looking forward to this program. Before we get started, I want to run through just a few housekeeping items. Again, please mute your lines and mute your cameras. Use the chat button at the bottom to put any of your questions as we go along. We'll answer those in the Q&A at the end. And I certainly want to recognize our sponsors for today, CBRE, Triad, Davis Martin Powell, and Fourth Elm Construction. We really appreciate you guys and are very thankful for your participation. I'm going to let Ryan and Sam, both gentlemen from Senator Tillis' staff in DC, take it from here.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Alex, and I appreciate the introduction and appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody today. Like Alex said, we serve Senator Tillis on the greater economic and business portfolio, and appreciate the introduction. A little bit more about me. My parents, and I actually know Sam's parents as well, are both small business owners in North Carolina. So certainly have been doing everything we can to not only help out North Carolina constituents over the past year, but a lot of times at night getting on the phone and trying to do what we can to chat through things with our parents. So kind of going through all this is something that we're happy to do, something that we're quite familiar with. It's what's kind of consumed our lives for the last 9-10 months, and happy to kind of jump in unless Sam, you have anything you want to say on the top.
Yeah, thanks everyone for giving us the opportunity to speak today. Like Ryan noted, this is obviously deeply personal to us in terms of this COVID relief, whether that's small business or individual relief. Very intricately familiar with the process, with the negotiations that have taken place over the past year, and just look forward to the presentation and any questions following. Ryan and I are more than happy to dive into.
Perfect. Well, I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get rolling from there. Can you go ahead and see the PowerPoint now at this point? Sam, just give me a thumbs up if it's all good. Yeah. Good. Okay. Alrighty. So actually, sorry. Is it still there? That's gonna be the best way so I can see my notes. Okay. So obviously wanted to talk about the COVID-19 economic relief. Kind of the place we wanted to start and what seemed to make the most sense to kind of give everyone a lay of the land and make sure everyone was familiar was a bit of a roadmap for the legislation that Congress has taken to this point. And so the major ones that we will talk about throughout this are going to be the CARES Act, which was the phase 3 package, and the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2021, which was the phase 4 package. But before we get into those, like I said, wanted to give kind of the full roadmap. So I'll start off and briefly mention phase 1 and 2, which were the first 2 packages that Congress passed. This was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act and the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act. So phase 1, was the first package passed. It was an $8.3 billion bill aimed largely at vaccine research and development. A lot of this was what stood up Operation Warp Speed, which we ultimately obviously got 2 successful vaccines out of and potentially more. And then the phase 2 bill was put into effect to expand paid leave and establish temporary federal unemployment benefits. Both of these kind of note were put into effect and especially negotiated and formulated before we had a real strong understanding of the massive impact that the pandemic was going to have. The phase 2 bill was really put into effect the day that things really started shutting down, which was about the middle of March, where businesses started to be shuttered, where our office went to full on work from home mode, as a lot of offices did. So these were kind of the first two steps that we put into effect to start mitigating the massive impact of COVID-19, but very quickly it became apparent that this was by no means going to be nowhere enough. So that brings us to the CARES Act, which was pretty much the most consequential piece of legislation passed last year regarding COVID. This was the third package, or phase 3, that we refer to. And in total, it was $2.2 trillion, was signed into law on March 27th, 2020. It's actually the largest stimulus package ever passed in United States history, and it was equivalent to 10% of total U.S. GDP for a year. So a pretty massive package. And the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, has estimated that phase 3 is going to add $1.7 trillion to the U.S. annual budget deficit. Some important things to know. Like I said, this was formulated and passed quickly after the economic collapse of March. And as Senator Tillis likes to say, we knew that we needed to do something big, bold, and fast. There have been subsequent rounds where we've gone to make improvements, tweaks to it that we'll get into. But at this point, when the national economy was being as battered as it was important for us to get something out the door as quickly as possible to kind of try and stem the tide of effect we were seeing in the economy. Some notable provisions, just to mention, that we'll probably refer to back throughout the rest of the presentation, are obviously the individual stimulus checks, the economic impact payments, as they're called. There's $300 billion of these payments to individual Americans. In the CARES Act, also included were $260 billion in increased temporary federal unemployment benefits. Obviously, the creation of the PPP program, which was a big issue for businesses, large and small. There was $350 billion in funding for this first go round of it, $500 billion in loans for corporations, and lastly, about $340 billion for state and local governments. But like I said, kind of the top line to think about for that is it is the largest economic stimulus ever passed in American history. And rightfully so, based off of the economic indications and economic numbers we were seeing at the time. Very quickly after that, the PPP program ran out of money that we had established for it. Like I said, it was originally $350 billion. And that funding was exhausted within, I think, about 13 days after the program went live. So there's what is colloquially referred to as phase 3.5, kind of a bridge between the CARES Act and the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act that topped off PPP funding and also included a few other provisions for funding for hospitals and testing for COVID-19, things of that nature. This was something that our office worked very hard on to get passed. Speaking with my parents and other business owners throughout North Carolina, we fully understand the impact that PPP has had for businesses. It's not by any means a perfect program, but given the short time frame we had to build the plane and start flying it in, we think that it performed pretty admirably and shows by how quickly things were drawn down, how much funding was utilized in that 13-day period before it was exhausted, that it really was meeting an unprecedented demand in the country. And so unfortunately, the money was exhausted in 13 days. It took the better part of a week or so of negotiations between Senate Republicans and House Democrats mainly to agree to a bill that would add additional funding to it. The additional funding bills that Senate Republicans tried to pass through unanimous consent were continually blocked for a week, while unrelated policy demands were made by House and Senate Democrats. So that was a frustrating time for us. My parents didn't get a PPP funding in the first go round. They were pretty desperately hoping for a second round. And I know that there were a lot of other North Carolinians and Americans in the same boat. And so for us, adding that additional funding in was a top priority and one that we wanted to get done as soon as possible. So we were happy when finally there was an agreement that provided about 310 or so more $1 billion to a second round of PPP funding. So that is kind of phase 3.5, which brings us to phase 4, which was the longest time period of negotiations and the longest amount of time it took throughout the year for a relief package to get put together. And unfortunately, it was the result of a lot of failure of bipartisan compromise to get a further package. But kind of some quick hitters in overview of this. The fourth package, which we passed right at the end of the year last year, combined about $900 billion in COVID relief with the annual appropriations bills that Congress has to pass each year to fund the government. So the total price tag for this package was about $2.3 trillion overall. So actually even bigger than the CARES Act, but that obviously includes the appropriations packages as well for regular government order. It's actually the longest piece of legislation ever written in Senate history, at 5,500 pages. So quite a behemoth. And this was something that, we pushed for. There are a lot of tweaks and improvements to programs and additional funding that our office was very supportive of and was very interested in advocating for that we'll get into here in a few moments, that luckily we were able to get in this bipartisan relief package. But Senator Tillis has consistently advocated throughout, ever since the summer, really, when we realized for the first time how long of a time frame this pandemic was going to have. I think, we by no means ever had particularly rosy expectations that it would be gone within a couple of weeks or anything like that some people were suggesting. But, when we passed the CARES Act, I think a lot of the prevailing wisdom at the time was that hopefully by midsummer we would have beaten this. And as the months dragged on, it became abundantly clear that was not the case. So phase 4 was not only important because we needed to get more stimulus to American businesses and the American economy, but also had to go through and revise a lot of the termination dates and extend programs past what they were originally authorized for under the CARES Act, because we still needed more time to combat this virus. So in total, Senator Tillis consistently advocated for additional relief packages throughout the summer and fall. He supported a $1 trillion proposal introduced by Senator McConnell in the summer, as well as a slightly slimmed down about $500 billion package introduced in September. Unfortunately, these proposals were repeatedly rejected in favor of the over $3 trillion HEROES Act. But ultimately, following the November election, a $900 billion phase 4 agreement, very similar to the one that Senate Republicans introduced midsummer, was agreed to by bipartisan majorities. So like I said, this package extends a lot of the previously enacted CARES Act proposals and timeframes. A lot of them had a December 30th, 2020 termination date. So we were able to extend these on out into Q1, Q2 of 2021. And also get in a host of different priorities for Senator Tillis and for a lot of business and individual requests that we had gotten from advocacy groups, from business and individuals themselves about the economic realities they were facing. But to put a brief bow on all this, I know I've thrown a lot at you guys and a lot of facts and figures at you. The total cost of the legislative action to combat coronavirus to date is about $3.6 trillion we have spent within less than a year. That's 82% of the annual federal budget for a normal year. So on top of what we normally spend each year, we've added an extra 82% on last year to try and combat coronavirus. So essentially almost spent 2 years worth of federal outlays. So that's kind of the quick and dirty of it to get you to where things are. Like I said, the CARES Act and then the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act are the two major ones. And from kind of here on out, we're going to more so focus on the latter, because obviously a lot of the provisions were amended throughout the year, updated, expanded, timeframes shifted. So don't want to overwhelm you too much with going through every little thing that has been updated, and want to just give you more so the current lay of the land moving forward. So with that, I will turn it on over to Sam for the next slide.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Ryan, for that update. And as you noted, we are focused on some of the specific provisions from the latest piece of legislation that was signed into law on December 27th, the Coronavirus Supplemental Relief and Appropriations Act. And as was noted in the previous slide, this bill did include some pretty important measures on individual assistance that the senator has been advocating for quite some time. We were incredibly pleased to see an additional round of direct payments included in this. We know that these have been, a really helpful piece of these pieces of legislation to help folks pay rent, put food on the table, and just generally with the associated costs involved with this new reality that we find ourselves in. So specifically, these payments, as I'm sure you all are aware, are direct payments of $600 for single filers, $1,200 for joint filers, and dependent children under the age of 17 are eligible for $600 direct payments as well. Obviously, these are tailored based on income, where the $600 for individuals is for folks that make under $75,000 as a single filer, or $1,200 for married couples that file jointly with an income of $150,000 or less. There was a specific provision that we were able to get into this piece of legislation that Senator Tillis and Senator Rubio worked really closely on to try and remedy some of the issues and pitfalls associated with the first round of direct payments. Specifically in the CARES Act direct payment provisions, they required both joint filers to have a work eligible Social Security number to qualify for payments. This Tillis-Rubio fix that we were one of the lead sponsors on reduced this to just one Social Security number per joint filer, meaning that the U.S. citizen that is married to someone, to an individual of undocumented origin, would still be eligible for that payment. So the husband that was a U.S. citizen, or the wife, vice versa, would still receive that payment and would not be blocked from receiving that aid due to their partner's status. Another key measure included in this legislation that we've continued to advocate for is expanded unemployment benefits. The CARES Act did have the federal subsidy on top of what the states provide at $600. Obviously, we believe that was really helpful at the time, but we have spoken to numerous business owners that have conveyed their concerns that this amount was really a disincentive for them to get some of their employees back to work. I mean, it just logically makes sense that if you're making more on unemployment than you would at your profession that you're employed by, it's a difficult incentive to return to work. So this provision passed in the latest piece of legislation is $300 federal dollars on top of what the states pay through March 14th, 2021. And this bill also included significant amounts of funds for the states to improve their unemployment systems. I mean, Ryan and I have personally worked on casework with hundreds of constituents that have had a really hard time with the Department of Employment Security in North Carolina, whether it's their phone lines being down or just the technology that they have isn't frankly prepared to deal with the onslaught of unemployment claims that they've gotten throughout the pandemic. So our next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Ryan, covers some of the small business and economic relief measures included in phase 4.
Sure. Thanks, Sammy. So obviously, like I said, up top, Sammy and I are both sons of small business owners. So I think that this portion was of special interest to us and certainly close to home. But obviously, while I said not perfect, the PPP program has been largely successful at helping businesses, small and medium size, keep afloat during this time. It was very important for us to stand up a program where businesses that would not have easy access to capital markets be able to get some sort of funding to help them bridge the gap. And the PPP program certainly did that. And as time wore on, we were very much aware that a second draw of PPP funding was going to really be required to keep businesses, a lot of them going on through the winter as well. So the most recent piece of legislation, phase 4, included the ability to do a second draw of PPP funding. It included a lot of notable improvements as well. Businesses that receive PPP loans would now be able to take tax deductions for the expenses covered by the forgiven loan, expanded the PPP eligibility for 501c6 nonprofits, included local newspapers, radios, and television broadcasters and destination marketing organizations, all ones that had struggled to get access in the first go round. We've been on numerous calls with 501c6 advocacy organizations that wanted this. Senator Tillis had long supported this expansion. We signed on to a few different letters circulated by Senate colleagues advocating for this expansion as far back as last May. So this was something that we were very happy to get included, and something we had really been pushing leadership and negotiators on for quite some time. Another really important thing that we got in that Senator Tillis was a major proponent of was bill to include simplified forgiveness for PPP loans under $150,000. Senator Tillis was one of the original co-sponsors of this bill with Senator Kramer, and it was something that we thought really made sense because the forgiveness requirements are fairly onerous for business owners that are struggling to make ends meet right now. And especially as time drug on, we realized that a formula that forgave most of, but not the entirety of a PPP loan was just not going to cut it for most people. So the $150,000 cap was determined because about 85% of all PPP loans given out were under that amount. So it was determined that was a good cap because it would encompass pretty much the majority of all, or not the majority, it would pretty much encompass all PPP loans issued. But still make sure that the ones that did go out for higher amounts were given the scrutiny that they deserve to make sure that there was no fraud or anything like that committed. But that was something that we considered a real non-negotiable for any phase 4 legislation to include, and we're happy to get that in. A few other quick hitters to note was there was a replenishment of the EIDL grant, which a lot of businesses and communities which the PPP loan didn't quite work for, didn't quite make sense for, were able to access. Didn't have the forgiveness portions that PPP does have, but it has a very low interest rate, especially for nonprofits, and also has the ability for a grant advance that businesses can access as well if they need money sort of ASAP before a PPP loan can process. And then one other thing that we really fought for was the Save Our Stages Act. One of the things, and this can kind of get into our conversation moving forward, and especially during the Q&A section, but one of the things that has really driven our mindset and the things that we want to work on throughout the last 4 or 5 months in Senator Tillis's office on these issues is trying to help provide funding for businesses that Senator Tillis kind of terms the first in, last out businesses. So places like live music venues, movie theaters, museums, places that were really the first that had to shut their doors and are going to be some of the last to not only be able to reopen, but some of the last that consumers will likely feel comfortable returning to in large volumes again, even if they are legally allowed to open at, in a hypothetical world, 100% capacity. It's probably going to be quite some time before movie theaters see the amount of demand to show up to watch movies that people had been accustomed to prior to the pandemic. So Save Our Stages addresses that, and it's funding for these independent movie theaters and live event venues to really kind of try and bridge that gap, and that's something that was important to us. We've unfortunately not been able to get it in, but have signed on to similar legislation for independent restaurants, signed on to another bill called the Restart Act, which had provisions like this. So those are all things that have shaped our approach to the stimulus over the last few months and will continue to shape our approach moving forward. But with that, I will turn it back over to Sam for the next slide.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Well, wanted to cover some of the more specific provisions in the latest piece of legislation most relevant to the group today, specifically some of the changes on housing and real estate. The main one that was put in place through this legislation and extended by President Biden, most recently by executive order, is a temporary extension to the current CDC eviction moratorium. The bill extended it until January 31st, but the president through EO, through the CDC, based upon a law actually passed in 1944 to address pandemics through the CDC by claiming that the housing crisis would further the spread of COVID-19, has extended this until March 31st. Frankly, the senator does not believe that this is a long-term solution to this issue. I can't tell you how many small landlords and large ones at that as well that Ryan and I have spoken to that have, an amount of tenants that quite frankly haven't had severe financial ramifications due to COVID-19, but because of this order being in place, have been refusing to pay rent. And now we have a significant financial issue with that background, as well as with landlords needing to pay the mortgage. So in an effort to remedy that on a temporary basis, the Phase 4 package did include $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. There are some pretty specific provisions through which folks may qualify for that from both the tenant and landlord side. Essentially, these funds are going to be allocated to states through the Department of Treasury, and state allocations are going to be based on population. So no state will receive less than 200 million. The language of this text in the latest piece of legislation allows landlords to apply for funds on behalf of tenants with tenant consent, and rental payments may include rent and arrears, as well as utilities and other expenses related to housing. And I think most importantly, the rental payments will be made directly to the housing provider or utility provider unless the payment is refused. So these funds are now in the process of being distributed to the states and should be available for application in the coming weeks. These funds, as they move from the states to the housing providers, are going to be available for eligible households. And there's some specific provisions for tenants to qualify for this. There's three main ones that I just wanted to highlight for you all at first. And the first one would be that one or more of the individuals within the household is qualified for either unemployment benefits or experience a severe reduction in income as a result of COVID-19. The second qualification is one or more individuals within the household can demonstrate risk of housing instability or homelessness through an eviction. And number three is the household has a household income that is not more than 80% of the area median income for this household. So those are the three main qualifications for tenants to qualify for this assistance. And importantly, like I noted earlier, funds will be made directly to property owners and the utility providers. Property owners in the coming weeks can begin applying for these funds on behalf of tenants, but it's important to note that tenants must sign that application. So we can head over to the next slide. Yeah, so like I noted, Treasury is going to be distributing this rental assistance to states and localities using the same formula used to distribute the Coronavirus Relief Fund in the original CARES Act. Yeah, Ryan, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. I think we've covered this. Yeah, so little noted in the latest package, but I know incredibly important to this group were some of the tax provisions changed in the latest bill. Obviously, these don't get as much press as some of the more big ticket items on small business and individual assistance, but obviously incredibly important to people in the real estate industry. So one of the big changes in this package was now real estate owners eligible to elect out of code section 163J interest expense limitation are required to use an alternate depreciation system for their real estate assets. So as most of you probably know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 reduced the recovery period for residential real property from 40 years to 30 years to make it easier for residential real estate owners to take advantage of the election out of this section. However, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act's reduction of the alternate depreciation system recovery period was effective only for property placed in service after January 1st, 2018. The latest COVID relief package clarifies that residential real property acquired before that date is also eligible for the 30-year recovery period as well. There's some other changes included. This act also provides for a permanent 4% minimum low income housing tax credit for subsidized housing for both acquisition credits and tax exempt private activity bond finance developments. So we'd like to see that this would be available and expand the viability of many projects in these particular areas. And another key change in addition is that the act increases the low income housing credit to states located in any qualified disaster zone in the years 2021 and 2022. Another key change in this legislation was the new markets tax credit has been extended for an additional 5 years through the end of 2030. Another change included that we received a lot of constituent and organization feedback on was the work opportunity tax credit has been extended to December 31st, 2025. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, a few other key tax changes that primarily affect the real estate industry. The waste to energy recovery property eligible for energy credit. It's a mouthful. Apologies there, but this bill is going to make waste to energy recovery property eligible for the Section 48 energy investment tax credit affected for 2021 through 2023. Legislation, another key change, made permanent the Section 19D deduction for energy efficient commercial buildings. And it's important to note this amount will be inflation adjusted after 2020. There was another key provision with the 2-year extension of the Section 25D residential energy efficient property credit. And this bill also makes qualified biomass fuel property expenditures eligible for this credit as well. Those are some of the main key tax changes involved in this legislation. After the presentation, happy to answer any and all questions regarding some of those as well. So just to wrap things up here, Ryan and I wanted to provide an opportunity to kind of give a look ahead as we're moving into the new administration, further relief packages, and just the general economic situation on both the monetary and fiscal front. First and foremost, with the new administration in place, one of their top priorities is passing an additional relief package. This was introduced not quite as a formal piece of legislation as of yet, but more of a framework from the Biden administration, notably called the American Rescue Plan. So we're in the beginning stages of reviewing this legislation, but essentially the information that we're happy to share today is that this is a $1.9 trillion plan. And as Ryan noted, we've already passed up to $3.6 trillion in COVID relief. So the cost of this, with this last bill being passed just a month ago, is fairly enormous and a serious consideration, particularly for Senate Republicans. We obviously want to see the economic ramifications of the latest bill signed, a term that's been used quite frequently by a lot of our colleagues is that the ink is still not even dry on this latest bill. So we certainly want to give it a little more time before pushing additional relief forward. There's certainly provisions of this legislation that we're in favor for, but there are also some provisions in there that are going to be difficult to swallow to pass this on a bipartisan basis, and we're fully aware of that.
And just to jump in really quickly, obviously we want to be cognizant and form our decisions based off what's happening on the ground and the economic numbers we're seeing. And in a recent Senate Banking Committee hearing, the CARES Act actually required there to be quarterly reports to Senate Banking Committee from both the Secretary of the Treasury. So at the time of this hearing that I'm talking about, it was still Secretary Mnuchin, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve as well, Jerome Powell. At the last one we had, which was shortly before the Phase 4 package was signed in December, I think it might have been like a December 17th or something like that, hearing, Senator Tillis posed the question to them in the hearing that, the next package, which was phase 4 at the time, in their view, did it need to be a bridge to Q1 or Q2 of 2021, at which point we expect to see the amount of vaccinations in America having picked up enough and being administered enough that things can start to slowly return to normal. And both Secretary Mnuchin and Chairman Powell said that they thought that that was the exact right way to think about it, that it needed to be a bridge to Q1, Q2. And so that's a large part of the reason why, Senator Tillis was so strongly in support of a phase 4 package. But now that that has been passed and that bridge has been extended, we will continue to monitor all of the indicators on the ground and all the economic numbers we're seeing over the next coming weeks. But the bridge has been extended. It's been put out there, and we want to make sure that bridge is allowed to work the way it was intended to by bipartisan majorities on both sides. So, to just kind of summarize and piggyback off of what Sam said, our boss will be certainly involved in any negotiations that move forward on a subsequent phase 5 package with the Biden administration. But, as of right now, we do feel like we have put that bridge to Q1, Q2 in place. And if the current vaccination trends and growth rates hold, then we feel pretty good about where things will be by Q1, Q2 for things starting to reopen and move towards a more normal society. So yeah, and Sam, if you want to hit the few other looking ahead points, feel free. I just want to chime in with that.
Absolutely. Well, appreciate that, Ryan. Yeah, so on the monetary policy front, there is an FOMC meeting taking place this week. Our estimation and anticipation is that they're going to continue to remain accommodative to the economy and incredibly dovish until we get back to that eventual reopening. We do believe that they're slated to continue the bond purchasing program to shore up the GSEs and the broader economy throughout the pandemic. And we do estimate the rates are going to remain low until the economy is on a more stable trajectory. As I'm sure you all saw yesterday, Janet Yellen was confirmed as Treasury Secretary. Senator Tillis was pleased to vote in favor of her due to her experience and her wide respect from world leaders, both in the financial markets and across the world, as well as expecting her to run a fairly competent Treasury Department and will provide very timely updates to the public and markets on, as Ryan noted, that economic data as we move out of the pandemic and into our eventual recovery. She does appear like she'll be a strong advocate for additional fiscal side relief in her negotiations with Capitol Hill. And we very much so look forward to working closely with the Yellen Treasury Department to support economic growth, reduce regulatory burdens for American businesses and families, and working closely with her during our eventual economic recovery post-pandemic. So again, thank you all so much for taking the time today, and we're more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Sam. We really appreciate it. That was a very thorough review. We haven't received many questions yet, other than will the PowerPoint be available, which we do have a copy of that, and provided that you guys are okay with us sharing that, we will, under the resources section on the website, also a recording of this. Before I forget, I do want to mention that today, for the first time, we're going to hold networking sessions after this for a few minutes. So all you have to do is remain on, and you'll automatically be thrown into a room with several of us. We have another question. What is the proposal to pay for all these stimulus bills?
That would be the $1 million question, I believe. Certainly, like I said, we have had a tremendous level of outlays this year compared to what we normally do in a federal fiscal year, essentially nearly paid for two years of governance instead of just one. And obviously, we think that it was necessary to do so with the economic conditions we saw. But it does mean that moving forward, we're going to have to become very cognizant and very real with our attempts to address the underlying problems with the federal budget. Senator Tillis has been a deficit and a debt hawk for quite some time, and I think that that's only going to become more so once we see the recovery really start to kick off. There have been a lot of proposals, especially in the phase 4 package that were put forward during negotiations to include automatic stabilizers and things that would let programs run on until they reached certain economic metrics before they would turn off. Those were things that we opposed as an office. Senator Tillis and Sam and I in our thinking, we all believe that this funding needs to have a very short leash on it, so Congress has the maximum amount of flexibility and power to control how much is going out and how long it runs for, because we are cognizant that once the recovery happens, we're going to have to really get serious about paying this down. So I think that those are all going to be things that we're going to have to work through over the coming Congresses. But we are more than aware of the problem that this massive amount of debt increase poses, and the massive amount of debt that we had prior to coronavirus as well.
Okay, and then any update on the status of the 1031 tax deferred program, whether it's in jeopardy of being cut, or has there been any discussion about that?
Off the top of my head, I don't have a firm answer on that, but would be more than happy to circle back once Sam and I can chase something down. I don't know if Sam, you're aware of anything at all. I'm not off the top of my head.
That's my understanding as well at the time, but happy to look into it further and provide an update.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind maybe just connecting us with the individual who asked the question. If you can do that, Alex, then we'd be happy to track it down and just get some clarity for him.
Of course. Does the hold on evictions apply to commercial properties and businesses, or just to residential applications?
Sammy, that's all you.
Absolutely. So our understanding at the time is that it applies to any resident in the state that's in a rental property, whether that's owned by a commercial organization or a multifamily apartment company. So if an individual is in their home as a renter and has experienced economic hardship as a result of COVID-19, they are covered under the federal CDC eviction moratorium. And there is a state moratorium in place that was extended by Governor Cooper until the end of January, whereas the federal policy, by nature of that executive order put in place by President Biden, has been extended until March 31st.
And then our last question, and then I have one, is the senator, what has the discussion been in your office around equal distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine?
Sure. I can take that one. And if you have specific thoughts or comments, always feel free to write our office. I will be candid up front by saying that neither Sam or I are the healthcare staffers. So while we are, at a high level familiar with the issues and the problems facing the distribution network, we are not the ones to speak definitively on it for the office. I think at the end of the day, Senator Tillis, as most people do, wants to see the maximum amount of vaccines going into people's arms as possible. We've seen a lot of reports of different localities in states and municipalities based off of how they have been structuring their vaccine dispersal programs that have had to waste vaccines, had to throw them away at the end of the day because they've been unfrozen and not been able to be used. Sam and I both live in DC because we work in the senator's DC office. Washington, DC has implemented a program where if someone doesn't show up for their vaccine appointment, the healthcare workers that are administering it are free to give it to anybody that is there at that time to make sure that they aren't wasted. So I think that, those are things that Senator Tillis would want to see in place in North Carolina. I know our healthcare staffers are very up to date with the issues that North Carolina is having right now in vaccine dispersal and working closely with the governor's office to see what sort of resources we can provide on the federal side to make things as smooth as possible. But at the end of the day, it's really comes down to making sure that these vaccines aren't wasted and are being put to good use as soon as possible, I think.
Okay, and then one last final question, and this is from me. I'm sure that the two of you and the rest in your office, particularly being related to the development and business office, business policy, what is the main tone of the questions that you're fielding right now? I know that a majority of your job right now is certainly dealing with COVID relief and trying to make sure that we can keep everything on track. But are there any more questions asked than usual in a business or particularly a real estate directed manner? Is it related more to evictions, or what part of this policy seems to be really striking most of the businesses in North Carolina?
Sure. I think with the fact that we have just recently passed phase 4, the majority of the questions that we are fielding and the things that we are hearing from constituents are the issues that they are having or running into, getting a second draw PPP loan, issues with workforce retention, with unemployment, the extension to unemployment, and struggle getting employees back, excuse me. And certainly, Sam has been kind of running point on these issues, but with evictions as well. I'm sure we've been hearing from that too, but it's right now, I guess I would categorize it as more process questions about, this has been put in place. Can you help me figure out how to access it? It's the questions that we spent months answering through the spring when these programs were all initially stood up, and now that there's a ability to access them a second time, we're getting a lot of the same questions. Obviously, questions with stimulus checks, economic impact payments have been a big one as well. Sam's main role on our team is interfacing with the constituents, so he may have a few other things he wants to mention as well. If you have anything else off the top of your head, Sam.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the main things on the real estate side we've been dealing with, and as I'm sure you're all aware of, is the eviction moratorium issue and the concerns we have with that. Ryan and I took part in a working group a few weeks back trying to find an amicable solution to the problem, because as we all know, and I think there is a misconception out there that most of the landlords in this country are not, these large multifamily folks that have huge portfolios of apartments. It's, people that own a duplex that have, someone that lives in the basement that's covering the mortgage. And those people have been particularly hurt by some of these policies put in place. So it's been working with a lot of those constituents, trying to find a solution. And we really want to get this rental assistance out the door as quickly as possible to the states, to the municipalities, and eventually to those landlords to be able to cover some of this rent in arrears, because at the end of the day, that mortgage has to be paid. And we don't want to see the downstream effects of that, where this turns into a greater economic pinch point that leaks into, the broader economy, whether that's the commercial mortgage-backed security industry or just a general housing issue in general. As we've seen, housing throughout the pandemic has been one of the most resilient sectors and has been a real bedrock of the economy due to the rate environment. And, I think some of the de-urbanization that's been going on with some of the events of the summer, as well as people realizing that if they can work remotely, there's no reason to be paying an exorbitant amount of rent in a large urban area. So these are issues we're focused on and look forward to working with the group as well as with all our constituents from North Carolina as we seek to work our way out of this crazy time.
Sam, Ryan, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We certainly are going to be able to take a lot from this, and you've put your emails there for anybody. You've offered very kindly to field emails with specific questions from our membership, so we appreciate that. I'd also like to thank again our generous sponsors for today, CBRE Triad, Davis Martin Powell, and Fourth Elm. We really appreciate you. If you will just hang on, I believe that we will be put into our individual breakout rooms should you want to hang around for that. And guys, thank you again. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys for the opportunity to speak today, and certainly, feel free to reach out to Sam or I as we move forward through our emails, and always happy to chat and provide the guidance or information that we are working under at the time. Obviously, so many of these programs are very fluid, and we are continuing to track each change, and always happy to provide updates and do what we can.
Thank you very much.